Good afternoon. It is great to see this many people at this session. I hope lunch doesn't weigh too heavily and I can keep you all awake because I think we have some great messaging and some great features to share with you that will help you be rest assured of data safety and what we're doing to protect your data in the cloud. So my name's Sarah Manning Dawson. I'm a group program manager on the Office 365 team. I began my career at Microsoft in '97, and I've been in engineering in Office since then. I was in Exchange for about 15 years in program management, working on everything from the very bottom of the stack in SMTP all the way up to our mobile app, MOA, or the OA app on the iPhone and on the Android. And we built the offline experience. I then spent a couple of years in the Office 365 compliance team, where I worked on e-discovery, auditing, and our device management. And I'm very excited to be talking about some of this as part of our security and control story in the context of how we help your users to keep your data more secure. So welcome. It's great to see this size of audience. All right, so what I hope that you are able to take with you at the end of the presentation is, I guess, a threefold set of verticals. The first one is really about protecting our data center as a whole, the service operations and all the data within it from malicious attackers. And with hundreds of billions of items living in our Office 365 data center, we are invested accordingly. And I look forward to talking through everywhere in the stack that we've made investments to make sure that your data is as secure as it can be in Office 365. The second vertical is that we are not only aware, but we are passionate about the concept of data sovereignty. I think some of you may have heard Satya refer to this earlier today, and we stand by it, and we have cases that I will talk through to support it. But it is your data, you own it, we represent your interests, and we see ourselves as custodians of your data. We're accountable to you, and we'll talk through all the ways that we keep your data secure in the service, and we keep you as the decision makers over who touches it. And the third pillar is about your peeps. And I think there's a lot of what I'll call outdated conventional wisdom about where the most important security investments are. If you take nothing else from this, take a call to action, if you will, to help your users protect their credentials, to help them get into a security mindset where they can't be hacked or their credentials can't easily be harvested. And we'll talk through features we have that will help with that. But remember, all the encryption in the world can't help if someone has privileged access to your data. So people, your greatest asset and your biggest liability, and we are here to help with that. I'd also like to talk through our transparency and control structure. So not only giving you the controls to manage how your data is accessed, but also a look into what's happening with it and understand how that, for many, many customers, is a stronger story than you're able to put on-prem. Now, what to leave behind? I've found working in the security space for a little while now, there tends to be a lot of religion and a lot of passionate opinions associated with security principles and how-tos in the security world. Get the facts and apply them, the principles, and apply them to how your operation works. Because it varies depending on what kind of data you're protecting, you know, whether you're a factory floor worker or your Philip Morris legal team. You may have different needs. Also, learning how to best apply them and tailor them to your organization is something I hope everyone here can leave with. All right, so let's take a step back and look at the threat landscape. Let's understand why we see the breaches that we do in the world today. The motivations, some of you may find surprising. Financial is about 70% of the public breaches that you see on the news. Some of the data in this presentation is pulled from the Verizon Data Breach Report. I think that's a great source of information. They can't always quantify everything, and they'll caveat with that, but a really interesting source of data from a security context. So about 70% financial. Espionage accounts for about 25%. And a thin slice, which I've called ideology, is more personal. This is about hackers wanting to maybe play out a grudge, or they have an ideology where they really want to embarrass a company they disagree with, or just for fun. But it's a fairly small slice, as you can see here. So I'd like this to be a little bit interactive. It is a big audience, so we'll try to make it frictionless. But some of the data behind some of the security realities is quite interesting. So I'll ask you questions, and in some cases, if you get it right, I have a prize, which, in alignment with the greatest reason for hackers to want to get to data, is money. You can't spend this one, but I promise you it probably tastes pretty good. All right, so let's try this out. My first question, and please just raise your hand. My first question is, can anyone guess what distribution espionage attackers are between two groups? One of them is what we call nation states. It's government-backed espionage, often from corrupted governments. And the other group is just organized crime units that like to do advanced persistent threat attack. Anyone care to guess how it's distributed? What percent and what percent across that as 100%? Any takers? It's chocolate. No, you can't answer, Levon. Yes. 80-20. You're very close. Anyone else? Okay, who's your 80, by the way?
The 20 being the state sponsor.
State sponsor, and 80 being organized crime? All right, so you guys are actually way off, which I know you wouldn't think that most of it's state-sponsored. From the data that we are able to gather, it's 90% state-sponsored. And most of those, actually, I guess you were closest, right? Or what'd you say, 75? Okay. Here, both of you, for being the first to step out on a limb and guess my questions. So interestingly enough, it's 90% state-sponsored, the vast majority in Eastern Europe and Eastern Asia. All right, so financial is a very big piece of this pie. Why? Well, in the case where a report tried to disseminate how much a breached record was worth, of course this is a very difficult thing to quantify, right? An email about the game last night is probably not as risky as an email that pointed out, yes, tobacco is harmful to people. So huge range, huge standard deviation, but the place that the data breach investigation report landed at the best back of the envelope was 58 cents per record. All right, anyone want to guess, using that calculation, how much dollars worth of data, or the dollar figure of risk of breach for all of the data in Exchange Online, in our Office 365 data center in Exchange? You can give me an order of magnitude. Anyone? Billions? It's not trillions. Anyone else? It is in the hundreds of billions, low hundreds of billions. But with that figure, there are a lot of records in our data center. Also, different companies and governments have tried to quantify how valuable it is to have stolen credentials. The numbers have varied a little bit, but in general, the order of magnitude is quite similar across them. So on the bottom, this comes from an older RSA report, and the top is from a government website, US government. They believe that a name plus password for an online bank account is worth about 1,000. In RSA, they believed it was 5 to 10% of what was in the account, which I'm sure varies as well. Let's see, Stripe data from a secure premium card, about 80 bucks. And then there's a little bit of deviation between, mom's maiden name and social security number being about 5. and then the whole package deal being a little bit less. There is belief that that is trending down, that it's becoming less and less valuable, and my hope is that that is because we're being smarter and smarter about having not just credentials, but things like multi-factor authentication and getting creative with the way we present to users requests for their credentials so they start to understand what is an attack and what is real. So this slide, I think, is one of the most important things for us to just socialize, because it goes back to what I was saying earlier about all the encryption in the world can't help you if you have a privileged user. And if you start to dig in to some of the greatest, or the biggest hacks or the things that have gotten the most media attention, you'll start to see a clear pattern. Now, this isn't always the case, right? There certainly is, there certainly are other reasons and other ways, but look at some of these recent data breaches. Home Depot, criminals used a third-party vendor's username and password. Target, stolen vendor credentials were used in the breach. Anthem, the company confirmed 5 tech employees had their credentials compromised. So what is not a useful security strategy if someone has harvested privileged credentials? Anyone? Well, passwords, but there's a belief that encrypting data can be a one-stop strategy, and we hear about that all the time when people talk about moving to the cloud and ways to mitigate. But remember that the vast majority ends up getting some kind of privilege before you're aware that they've gained that privilege. Of course, there are exceptions. If you look at the Sony breach, that was certainly ideology. The FBI believes it was North Korea, so a state-sponsored attack, and they were angry. They did it to embarrass Sony, even though they got some financial gain out of some PII. It was ideology, and it was through the back door. They persisted. It was called an advanced persistent threat, but they got a leg into Sony's network and were able to bring down some of the servers and really get in the way of operations through the back door rather than through credentials. So that's a little bit of the landscape, and I'll tell you what we hear often from customers. Now, before I do, I'd love to see a show of hands. How many of you already have at least one mailbox active in our cloud service in Office 365? All right. And how many of you are just completely on-prem? That just helps me know how many are just sleeping or don't want to raise their hand. But thank you. That's about 4 to 1. So most of you are in our cloud service. And I'm pleased to hear that because I think we have a great security story, and I look forward to sharing it with you. So what we have heard is that the biggest single concern, if I had to summarize it, is security. And of course it is. Of course it is. You're taking data that you control, that you know where it is, you know who's touching it, and you're putting it into a service where you have a perception that that's not true. And we can certainly appreciate that. In the early 1900s, homes would not go on the power grid because they thought they were very nervous about someone else controlling power to their house. And my hope is that as we move forward, right, it becomes a no-brainer that the cloud and its security is stronger than what you can offer on-prem. And so it actually becomes an advantage to move to the cloud rather than a fear. But it is certainly true that we will become custodians of your data, and you now have more people who can potentially access it. So we hear you. So I added this slide in. It's quite a simple concept, but the point of this slide is that, you know, in security, there's no such thing as absolutes, right? If anyone ever tells you that you can move your data into their data center and it will always be safe forever, absolutely, they're naive. Right? It doesn't work like that. But what we can do is we can take the defenses that we put in place and push them so far to the right that security just becomes a thought maybe a quiet concern in the back of your head that you stay aware of, rather than something that keeps you up at night. The other thing I want to take from this graph, or I hope you take from this graph, is that it's not linear, right? The reason that I see it more as asymptotic is that there are a few things that you can do that can greatly reduce your risk. And we'll talk through what those are in the presentation, but bear this in mind, because there's some really sort of easy wins, if you will, in order to bring your risk way down. And I'll talk through the suite of things we offer at the data center level, at the custodial level, and then at the end user, your PEEPS level, that will help you push that line as far to the right as possible, reducing your risk. All right, so we talked about hundreds of billions of records, and we are invested accordingly. And the way that I think about that in terms of talking about what we offer is this is the malicious outside attacker threatening the service. So we'll talk about all the stuff that we offer in O365 to help mitigate this. The second thing is your data. So you're nervous about who's touching your stuff, of course. We'll talk about that in terms of custodial access and how we make sure that you are in control of who touches your data. And the third thing, your greatest assets and your biggest security liability, your PEEPS. We'll talk about things we have in place to help well-intending users that make mistakes, which is often the case when credentials are harvested. And we'll also talk about ways that you can see or detect or help protect against malicious insiders. All right, so threats to the service. This is our data center-wide operations and how we stop backdoor vulnerabilities and backdoor hacks. So let's talk a little bit about cloud security surface area. You know, for those of you who are familiar with cloud services, they're loosely divided into three categories. I mean, this is loose, it's never quite this cut and dry depending on what cloud service you're in. But there are infrastructure as a service, there's platform as a service, and then there's security, software as a service. So infrastructure as a service, you're really buying the hardware and you're buying the network. And you're using some other provider to do that, and then you're building everything above that from the OS on up. In platform as a service, you're running on some other cloud provider that provides you all the way up to the OS, and for some services that run on the OS, and the applications and data are yours to run within that context. For software as a service, the service provider owns the stack, and you bring your data. So the security accountability and responsibility is for the owners of the teal. And where is Office 365 in these buckets? All right, you want chocolate? SaaS, yes. So Office 365 lives here, and as custodians of your data, we hold ourselves accountable, and we are responsible for the security of that data and the security of everything all the way up the stack. So how do we do this? Well, any of you familiar with security are probably familiar with the term defense in depth. And really, it's a term that goes back to just putting as many defenses in place as you can in order to get that line as far to the right in that asymptotic curve as we can. And so every layer, we look to figure out how we can better secure that layer. So we've got the physical security. Well, we've got your data, your content, of course, and we'll talk about that. We also want to take care of the physical security of our data center and the boxes within it, the network, hosts and applications running on it. And of course, in the other two sections, we'll talk about the custodians, the people that are running the data center and operating on that. And then we'll talk about your end users and your admins. All right. So in terms of physical security, there are a few things we do in all of our data centers. And as you may know, we have data centers spread out through the world, most of them in the United States. Okay, bit of trivia. In the United States, where do we try to locate our data centers beside? What do we need for the data centers we try to get really close to? What's that? Yes. Yeah, power, but through hydroelectric. Are you a chocolate person? You know what? I'm going to hit somebody. Thank you, VJ. Yes, power generation, the closest we can get to the source, the cheaper it is and the more environmental. So perimeter security, we have guards around the perimeter of our data center 24/7. We've got motion sensors, we've got video surveillance, we have loud sirens if there's ever a breach. When it comes to people who are privileged, who are allowed in the data center, they have to pass various, what's that? Yes, thank you. Various background checks and screenings is the word that was stuck. Various screenings, and when they come in, they've got to do biometric scanning and have 2 factors of authentication as well. So we do extensive monitoring, obviously, within the data center of who is coming and going. And not only do we have a fire suppression story, but being sort of located in Seattle or having our home in Seattle, all of our data centers have seismic reinforcement in the racks. All right, quick question. Yeah, maybe we'll do chocolate for this one, but hopefully it's an easy one. Does anyone know how many levels of redundancy we have in all of our Exchange mailbox data? How many copies do we always have? Who said 3? All right, the gentleman in the glasses. Yes, 3. And we do not keep them all in the same geographic location. All right, in terms of network security, hopefully it's obvious, but we certainly isolate our data centers from one another. And so the Office 365 data center is separate from Azure, which is separate from Bing. We also have router ACLs and load balancers on the edge. One of the, I guess one of the cornerstones of the security at this layer is that we use TLS for all server-to-server communication. And in all client communication with the servers, we use SSL. So this is outside of what users can do themselves to encrypt particular content, like through RMS. At a lower layer across our data center, we use TLS and SSL. Yeah, so one of the things to call out about the edge routers is that they do security and vulnerability detection, and they keep updated lists of bad IPs and bad actors. So at the host application level, we do a number of things as well. One of them is in our patching and malware protection story, we do steady scanning at all times of what is running on the machines. And not only do we whitelist processes, so we have a fixed set of processes that we know should be running on those machines, but in our detection software, we know what those processes should be able to spawn and what they shouldn't. And if we ever see something odd, it is flagged and we investigate it. It's often an operator having to do something or restart something, but we flag it and we're cognizant of anything that isn't algorithmically typical. 0 standing permissions in the service. This one is probably one of the most important things in terms of being the custodians, but not having free access to your data. Not only do we have 0 standing permissions in the service, but the place where we do all of the management, so we run all of the scripts, we do the deployments, it is a whole separate forest, and so the AD is completely separate from all the customer data. That forest and the accounts in that forest are completely separate from our Microsoft user accounts. And so if we ever have to go in and run any kind of scripts in the service, we have a very unique identity. That identity has a very short lifetime, and it has to go through a very rigorous approval process. So if you can picture it, we've got this large sea of data centers across the world, but no one at Microsoft has access by default. It is just you. It's you and your organization that is able to access them. Then within this management forest, we're able to algorithmically run jobs like patching and deploying updates and latest builds. But when it comes to some user, some DC operator needing to have access, that's done in an even more separate process with a temporary account that has very limited access and very stringent requirements to get access. Of course, we operate all touches to customer data, which are very rare, and we also audit every other activity that we do, like running scripts and patching and deploying software. So we'll talk a little bit more about exactly how that works in terms of DC operators having access to the data center, and then in a very limited way or very rarely needing access to customer data. The thing I wanted to just finish off with in terms of what we do in our data centers to keep everyone safe is that we prove to ourselves that our vigilance is working. And we have a very, very rigorous set of proofs. So we monitor emerging threats. We practice executing on post-breach. We do war games exercises where we invite other security teams from Microsoft to come and test something, try to breach us, test a vulnerability. But probably the three most interesting and very effective ways that we are able to harden our data center against security breaches is through red teaming, blue teaming, and the bug bounty program that we introduced a year ago. So red teaming is literally professional hackers. We have full-time employees, a team of them in Office 365 security, that spend their time thinking of all the back doors they possibly can and trying to get into the data center, of course with a do no harm approach. And they play sort of a cat and mouse game with the blue team, which is our security detection and incident response team. And so we watch very carefully how long the red team takes to get in, if they do, and how long the blue team takes to figure out that they're there. And with this loop, with this iterative loop, we are consistently hardening our data center against threats. And the red team has had to get very, very sophisticated in order to find backdoors. And of course, as soon as we learn of them, we respond appropriately. So the time to breach we see is ever extending, which is our success metric, right? It's hard to have a security success metric, but our red team are some of the most talented people I've met. It's amazing how creative what they do is. And they work with our legal team because they do things like key logging breaching our data center sort of requires a check and balance. So they work with our legal team, but very, very talented hackers. The bug bounty program, Google and Facebook have been doing this a little while. We introduced it a year ago. And what the bug bounty is it's crowdsourced pen testing, crowdsourced penetration testing, the red teaming stuff, but opening it up to the rest of the world. And about a year ago, we paid people to find security vulnerabilities in Office 365 and report them with a do no harm requirement, of course. And we, just a couple of weeks ago, introduced, we are upping the ante, not only to be competitive with the other big data centers, but also to make it more worth hackers' while to tell us about it than to sell these vulnerabilities on the black market. And Google and Facebook, like I say, they've been doing this a while as well, and we're up to, I think, $15,000 or $20,000 for any breach found, depending on the scope of the breach and how sophisticated it is. But we have a fairly large payout because we really appreciate having some, or being able to crowdsource vulnerabilities. So in doing this, of course, there are times when our detection team flags things. And when they flag things, they go through a rigorous process to understand what happened, what the threat is, and go through a breach response process. And so the pen testers will watch this without telling the detection team what's going on. We'll just watch and make note of what we find when, so that we can loop through and harden our breach and incident response process. All right, on top of defense in depth and holding ourselves accountable for hardening that defense in depth, we also offer some encryption tools at the tenant level. So again, this is beyond what clients and end users can do to encrypt messages point to point or to encrypt documents. So we talked about encryption in transit by default being transport layer security and SSL for all client to server communications. We also have BitLocker enforced in all data at rest in our data centers. So an operator can't just pull out a drive, take it home, and get the data off of it. But very recently, we introduced yet another layer of security, a little bit higher in the stack, if you will, that allows content level encryption while not losing any of the functionality in the data center. And this is file level encryption in OneDrive and message level encryption in Exchange. The key to this is that the customer controls the keys. The customer gets to decide if they're revoked. The customer gets to decide if they're created. But the keys for these features reside in the Azure Key Vault. Now, let's double click on that a little bit, because one of the most common things that customers ask for when they come to the data center is, I want to encrypt all my data and I want to use my keys. And that's understandable, right? That sounds very secure, except of course leaked credentials. But it sounds very secure, but there's a limit. There's a limit to what we can do if we don't have key access to your data. So of course, the vision that we have, or the vision that customers bring, is that their clients, their end users, can go access their key on their premise and go get the data. But that kind of relegates the richness of Office 365 to a database, right? With a few more client level controls. But it means that without access to your data, we can't offer all of the value that we offer today in things we do along the pipeline without clients accessing the data. For example, data loss prevention parses the content of your message to be able to apply policies. Without being able to access the data, we're unable to do that. Search can't index if we don't have access to the content. And we do things to gather insights and general content analysis. And without the data in the message, that's difficult to do. So it takes away some of the value that we offer in the service. So the solution is that you control the keys, but we store them in the Azure Key Vault, and we publish a lot of great information about the Azure Key Vault and how it's secured. That allows us, when there's something we need to do that requires access to the data algorithmically, it allows us to retrieve the keys in our code and decrypt it so that we're able to offer things like data loss prevention, search, and insights. So let's talk about how OneDrive does it. We'll talk about OneDrive and we'll talk about Exchange. So OneDrive does per file encryption, and it actually distributes files for a single tenant across different Azure storage containers. So this makes it or a lot safer, because a single storage container breach or a loss of the storage container does not mean a disaster loss of your data or leakage of your data. So we distribute it across, it's encrypted. The keys that encrypt the data are stored in the Azure Key Vault, which itself is encrypted. And then for a third layer of indirection, the file mapping that tells the keys which Azure Key Vault is also stored separately. So it would be quite a mammoth task to reverse engineer and break through both encryption processes to get to your data. Probably a lot easier to fish for credentials at that point. And Exchange offers per message encryption. So in this case, again, the keys are stored in the Azure Key Vault, but they are controlled by the customer and can be revoked by the customer. So the customer controlled keys When a message is sent, we use that key to encrypt the data at rest, but have algorithmic access to the content so we can offer things like DLP and search. All right. So last slide in the overall data center safety is about compliance. A lot of companies, understandably, see compliance as part of their security story because this speaks to how we handle the data, what we do with it, what we do with PII, how we make sure that you're able to comply with the regulations that you need to comply with. There's two ways to think about some of these compliance tools or accreditations. One of them is the set of things that we have accreditation for in our data center, the things that we support 100% in the way our processes work and in the way we handle and store data. So things like our ISO 27001 and more recently 27018, those were granted to us in the way we operate our data center. But for something like the HIPAA business agreement, or what's another example? The EU model clause, that's us saying we do our part in Office 365, but you need to do the rest of it in how you handle the data, and together we can guarantee your compliance. So for the piece that we own in terms of software as a service, we are compliant such that you can claim compliancy if you handle your data properly. Now in some of these slides you'll see a banner in the top right corner, and that banner cites sessions that are later in the week that you can go to and learn more about that particular technology. Since we're going over the gamut of security, we don't have time to deep dive in a lot of this, but yeah, feel free if you want to learn more about anything we're talking about today to just jot down or dig up the slides later and attend those sessions. All right, so custodial access. This is about data center operators having access to your data. We've talked already a little bit about the data center and some of the requirements. But I just wanted to go into a little bit more depth and then talk about a pretty industry-leading feature that we're introducing this year called Customer Lockbox. So how do we make sure the people that are managing your data will manage it well? We do background checks, screening, and they are integrated with our HR system. So I have an account which, if I need to elevate, will allow me to access the scripts and run scripts in the data center. And in order to do that, I had to go through a background check. I had to go through a screening process. I got annual training. It's required. There's a couple of security courses that are critical for anyone who may gain access to the data center to take. As well as all of our software goes through the security development life cycle. So we very carefully threat model the features that we add to the data center and make sure that we've reduced all vulnerabilities as best we can before we even check in the code. So in terms of account management, as I mentioned before, the sea of data across our data centers is only accessible by people in your organization. We do not have anyone with standing access to your data. In the management forest, we can request elevated access, which will then provision what's called a JIT account, a just-in-time account, that has very limited access. It's scoped access based on what tasks need to be run, depending on why the elevation was requested, and it expires. And our default expiry is 1 or 2 hours, depending on what tasks have to be run. We also have machine-generated passwords, and the people who have to approve the elevation requests do it through 2FA. So there is a technology that we use called Lockbox. And what Lockbox is it's kind of 3 levels of security around an engineer possibly needing to do something, run some kind of script in the data center. In very, very rare cases, that will require access to customer data. But we've defined those cases very specifically and put them into roles so that we are aware if an elevation request needs access to customer data, the approver asks the right questions. So we get a customer that calls and says, look, there's a mailbox that's corrupt. I can't connect to it through Outlook. I don't know what's going on. Can you fix it? And so we want to use some lower level tools to see if we can recover the mailbox. So they'll call into us. They'll get an engineer who has the right background checks and security training, who's in good standing in the organization. And that engineer, usually the on-call engineer, goes through what's called a lockbox system and issues a request. And that request goes to a Microsoft manager, second level or higher. So it would be a manager of managers. And that manager looks at a few things on the request. They'll look at the amount of time that that engineer has asked for access. They'll look at what access. Often it's just to run a script or to patch something or to fix something. On rare occasion, it's a request to access customer data. And if it looks good, they'll approve it. And with the technology that we use, it's called Taurus. There's a new technology we've introduced that requires the manager to go through 2FA. And so there's sort of three tiers, right? There's the engineer vetting the request. There's the Microsoft M2 looking at the request and making sure it makes sense. And then there's two-factor auth to make sure that that manager is who we believe they are. And from there, the engineer is able to run whatever they need to run within the data center. So scope least privileged access, JIT accounts, and in every case, we keep audit logs for access to customer data, and you have access to those audit logs. So this is a question, I guess it's mostly an opinion question, but I still have chocolate up here. So anyone brave enough to give an opinion, enjoy. What do you think would be an even better person? Who would be the best person to decide who should get access to your data along this workflow? I'm not left-handed, here goes. The customer, right? Whose data is it? Yes, it's yours. It's your data. We are stewards. We don't want to touch it. We're accountable to you. Wouldn't it be great if we could involve you in the approval process so that you were a gatekeeper to any time that Microsoft engineer may need to access customer data? And so we built it. We are very proud to introduce a feature called Customer Lockbox. We just announced it at RSA a couple of weeks ago, and it will not be available until the end of 2015. But for all access to customer data that an engineer needs to do, they not only go through the lockbox approval process with the manager, but the next step is that it goes to you. And you decide whether or not it's kosher. All cases that I've heard of have been because of support calls where the customer has needed us to go in and do something. But as I said, there's no absolutes in security, and I certainly won't make promises that depend on human behavior, because we can be crazy sometimes. So let's put it into your hands. Let's give you the chance to decide whether to approve it or not. So we're very proud that the traditional lockbox flow will be sitting on a screen. There we go. The traditional lockbox flow will have a new player in it, a fourth gate, if you will, after the engineer, the manager, the 2FA, and now you. You can sign up for Customer Lockbox. You will control authorization of who gets to see your data. You will get an email which has a link. That link will take you to our admin center where you can click approve. That approval lasts for just 30 minutes, and then it expires. There will be a session, most of it devoted to this, where we will demo it and you can walk through all the steps and the stages. It's Thursday morning. Vijay, the product marketing counterpart that owns security in Office 365 marketing, will be presenting that together with Anand on my program management team. And they have a great demo put together. So if you want to learn more about this feature, it really is industry leading. And we're hoping that it will absolve a lot of fears about losing control of your data. So just a quick screenshot of what you can expect if you get a request for a Microsoft engineer to access your data. You'll get an email. If you click on the link, you will go to this page you will be led to this page in the admin console where you can choose to approve or reject. There's a reference number that we can tie back to customer support. So you're clear. And again, 30 minutes standing access only. All right, so any guessers feel like taking a crack at how often, on average, for an average tenant in Office 365, how often per year do we need to touch your data? Do we need to get this approval for access to customer data? I heard 0, 1%, less than once a year. You are correct that it is very small. It is not 3. It's 3 times 10 to the 4th. And, oh, sorry, 3 times 10 to the negative 4th, yeah. Subtle difference there. If you're listening to the talk track later, it's 3 times 10 to the negative 4th, thank you. So 3 times 10 to the negative 4th, you can expect to have to go to this page once every 3,300 years. We did a back of the envelope calculation, and for an average tenant, that's what you're looking at. So we don't expect you to ever need to use this, but go turn it on. If you're worried, turn it on. And if it ever happens, you know, that for some reason you need us to get to your data or to run a recover mailbox or whatever, you will be in control. All right, who said less than 1%? I heard, was that you? Here. I would love to address that, and I promise I will do my best to leave time for questions at the end. Please feel free at the end to come up to that microphone and repeat what you just asked. All right, another big concern moving to the cloud is that Microsoft is going to act as an agent for whatever nation state we might be afraid of, because the Justice Department, you know, was on our case in the 90s, and who knows what, you know, handshake Microsoft has made with the US government or other governments, who knows? And that's understandable. Of course, it's hard to imagine, and I've heard a lot of stories, you know, or rumors or religion about this. And so I just wanted to be very, very clear that we are not an agent of anyone but you and your data. That's our job. If you look at it from purely a business standpoint, we have a reputation to protect. We've got hundreds of billions of documents, mails. We've got your data, and it's our business to make sure that you trust us to be good stewards of that data. So we'll only disclose it when legally required, only after attempting to redirect, and that's only if the demands make sense and follow the Fourth Amendment clearly. We back up these commitments in our contract, and we do resist things that we just don't think have enough grounding, we don't think have been well enough thought out, that may have been thrown in our direction to, you know, see if they can get the data more easily than going to the customer themselves. We are certainly not agents of anyone but you. And we put our commitments into action. So here's a few cases of where we have challenged things that we're seeking customer data that we just didn't think were legit. So a US warrant into some information in our Dublin data center. That is still active. We are still fighting it. It's on appeal right now. The middle one, we got a national security letter from the FBI asking us to get data and not disclose to the customer that we had gotten it. We pushed back hard, we fought it, and the FBI withdrew the demand. This isn't that we're like anti-government, right? This is a country that we love and we want the government to be able to protect it, but there's a balance, right? And we want to make sure there's a check and balance, and we want to protect the Fourth Amendment rights, which extends to corporations through case law that is ages old. Government requests for transparency. The US government said, we can't tell you how often they give us blind subpoenas. And we said, yes, we can. And so we came to an agreement with the US government after pushing back hard. We give a range, and you can see this on the Office 365 Trust site. So we will always represent your interest. This is just to debunk any myths. We don't engineer backdoors for governments. We're not part of a bigger surveillance program. And we don't assist with any government efforts to break encryption or to provide nation states with encryption keys. So I hope that's clear, but if you have any questions or you need to bubble something up, please go to the Office 365 Trust Center. We've also got a great blog that our GC, our head of global counsel, puts together about these things and about some of the court cases in it. All right. And the final tier of the agenda is insider access. And this can look like a user doing the wrong thing by mistake, which, you hear of stories like that all the time. I actually got I got a phishing attack from our red teamers. So our pen testers, like I say, they're very clever, and they'll often try to phish the DC operators. And it's not a very obvious phishing attack. They're pretty amazing at the way they can spoof emails. And so, we've been trained to be phish police, if you will. But even us, we need that knowledge, we need that training, we need that hardening in order to be great at our jobs and to keep our cred secure. Also, malicious attackers look very different in the way that we handle them, but I'll talk through some of the tools we have that you may be able to detect or to help mitigate against the risk presented by them. And when we talk about this section, by the way, when we talk about malicious outsiders, if there's malicious outsiders that have gained privilege access, we'll talk about that threat within this section, because for all intents and purposes, they're the same as rogue insiders. They can do similar damage, and we have similar tools. So just to clarify that, even though they're outsiders, if they have privilege access, we then consider them rogue insiders for the purpose of this talk. All right, so a very simple threat landscape, but we'll talk about threats in accessing and moving the data. So, users logging in and then getting a hold of the data, and then client-side storage. So where users put the data and how we can help secure that. All right, and just to call out a talk that will go into more detail on this. This is mostly in what's called our information protection team. It's led by Levon, who's up here. Levon, are you doing this talk? Rudy's doing it, all right. So the director of the information protection team will be doing this talk. And lots of goodness here to help your users make the right decisions when they're looking at a phished email, for example, or sending something with credit cards, or some content they shouldn't be sending with unwittingly. Okay, so if you take nothing else from this presentation, from this session, please look into multi-factor authentication if you haven't already. I hope the message has landed that many, many data breaches, I would say the vast majority, are because of credentials, somehow ill-gotten and ill-used. And all the encryption in the world can't save you until you realize that those credentials have been breached, because otherwise it's privileged access by design. So multi-factor auth, it does get in the way of productivity. The unfortunate thing is all security and compliance is at odds with user productivity. So we do everything we can to minimize the impact on the user, but multi-factor authentication lets you counter the case where credentials are stolen that are just username and password. For those of you who haven't heard the term before, it's also called 2FA, two-factor authentication. And what it requires is that the user prove themselves by something they know, which is the username and password, and something they have. Because those two things together add much more credence to knowing it's them. And in this case, something you have is your personal cell phone. So MFA very often is done through texting or calling or a mobile app that allows you to do MFA. In our case, and what we offer through Azure in Office 365 is either of these three options. But what it will do is when your user types in their credentials, if it's just username and password, it will make them verify who they are through something they have, which in this case is a mobile phone. Now, it's a drag for users. When this was rolled out at Microsoft, I mean, it was a no-brainer that we did it, but it was a pain, right? I found it painful sometimes, just trying to get to this website on my phone, right? So you can make choices that work for your org to perhaps limit when 2FA applies or when MFA applies. Maybe if the domain or if the machine is domain joined and it's on, or you're connected to CorpNet, you know, maybe you can step back and just do it when you're outside of the network. You know, make choices that work for your enterprise or your organization. But really, if you haven't yet, please look into 2FA or MFA if you want to do more than two. But really an effective way against probably the biggest threat, which is credentials being lost or hacked or stolen. So more on this in an Azure AD session listed up there. And yeah, if you don't know much about MFA, I do invite you to go to this session. Just a great way to counter credential theft. Another thing that we are doing on our perimeter is helping with phishing attacks. Again, we were talking to the FBI a couple of weeks ago just about, you know, they were curious about what we were doing to help in this space. And apparently it's been horrible, some of the phishing attacks that are coming out of organized crime units, mostly in West Africa, Nigeria area, taking a lot of elderly people for all they have. Apparently they're losing millions, mostly, I guess they were organized rings and they're starting to track them down, but there's some really sad stories. So, you know, the FBI was just asking us, what are you developing that maybe we can tell people about or how we can help them to understand what's a phishing message and what isn't? Well, traditionally, you know, we've been very diligent about keeping a number of things updated in our anti-spam, antivirus, and one of them is our URL block lists. But what the latest sophisticated phishing attacks will do is they'll send out mail with a bad link, and maybe within 15 minutes that link will have been discovered, but all of the messages that got delivered between when the phisher first started and when the URL was listed as malware is sitting in the user's inbox. And then the attacker just puts a different link up, right? And so it's just a game of chasing them. Well, the IP team has created a package of great tools called Advanced Threat Protection, and within it, they offer something called Safe Links. So again, if you're worried about phishing attacks, please do go to the session that's listed up there to learn more about it. But what it does is when the message comes in, they will rewrite the URL to point to a proxy server that we own. It's in Office 365, and what it does is it will check that URL at the time the user clicks on it. So all of the goodness that we've learned about malicious URLs between the time that gets delivered and the time the user clicks, we can take advantage of that and help the user to be safe. So Safe Links, you can configure it in EOP, and what will happen is at the time of the click, the URL will redirect. Our Exchange Online Protection will go and check that URL at that time, and of course it it will have been blacklisted by then in our hypothetical. And so the user will just see that this has been classified as malicious, and they'll be safer. All right, another great technology coming out of our perimeter, our online protection perimeter, is support for what's called DMARC and DKIM. These are industry standards, so it's like a group getting together and deciding how email should work and agreeing, and then the big email providers going and implementing it. In this case, DKIM stands for Domain Key Identified Mail, and what it stops is for someone who does not own a domain to be able to spoof that domain to make the mail look like it was coming from that domain in the from field. And the way that they do it is the owner of the domain inserts a signature in the header of the email for all the emails that are sent out. And for the recipients that support DKIM, they will take the public key of that sender and verify that it was indeed the domain that the from field says that it came from. And so it verifies the sender's identity as that domain, matches it against the from, and therefore can ensure that if it came from bankofamerica.com, it was truly Bank of America because there was a DKIM signature in it from the bankofamerica.com domain. So it makes sure that the domain owner is the same domain that showed up in the from field. So DMARC, domain-based message and reporting compliance, uses the DKIM technology together with the sender policy framework, or SPF technology, to make sure that both the from field and the mail from field, which is the address that bounce messages go back to, and it's more of a routing from address, but to make sure that neither of those were spoofed. And so Exchange Online has introduced both DMARC and DKIM supports for domains that are within Office 365. So please take advantage of this session where you can learn more about how that can help your organization. All right, so client-side encryption tools that end users can use to safeguard messages. Rights Management Service has been around for a long time, so I won't spend too much time on that, but like SMIME, which is more of an industry standard, it allows encryption of an email from point to point, and rights management also allows you to encrypt things like the content or particular documents. Office 365 message encryption allows places like banks and healthcare organizations to send messages out encrypted to external users and gives the external user an easy path back in to decrypt the message and to see it, all using keys that are stored in your tenant. So the keys don't move around. The one gating factor is that recipient either needs to have a Microsoft account or create a Microsoft account. But that's the one step in the process that will allow you to send encrypted messages to your users. So just a quick walk through message encryption. The user sends it, and our policy detection engine, the same thing that DLP, data loss prevention, uses, parses the message content, and based on what you've told it to look out for, maybe patterns or fingerprints of docs, it'll recognize it, and it will decide whether or not to encrypt it, keeping the keys in the tenant configuration store. From there, it delivers it to the user, and when the user goes to read it, it actually posts, within the message there's a link, and when the user opens that, it will post it to a mail reading portal where the user will be asked to log in with a Microsoft account where the username matches that email address. And so if they don't have one, they'll have the option to create one, or they can just log in if they already have a Microsoft account associated with that email address. And from there, we can retrieve the key because that Microsoft account is unique and equal to the 2 on the message, and the user can read. Whoops. Data loss prevention. We've talked a little bit about this already, and we really market this as a way to help well-intending users do the right thing, but it certainly is a tool that organizations have found help them with security as well, in stopping even malicious users from letting things leak out, or from having audit logs to see when people are sending things out, or when people, seem to be managing or working with content in a way that doesn't really follow policy. So it's probably a good litmus test, can be a canary for issues or breaches internally, or just helping prevent them. But for the most part, this is really designed for well-intending users to do the right thing. So what it does is, in both OneDrive and Exchange, it will scan the content of a message as it goes through transport, or scan the content of a document when it's saved to OneDrive, and look for patterns as you've specified. So if you don't want credit card documents stored in OneDrive, a DLP policy, you can create a DLP policy to say, on save, as soon as I index this, give me some kind of warning, or tell me, or don't let this document be created. And so what it allows is control over both the flow of data and the commitment of data to disk, to OneDrive, based on patterns that you see in the data. And there'll be more information about that in the end-to-end DLP talk, which is later this week as well. Another thing, actually, I should note about DLP is there's a few things you can do once you recognize a pattern. Like once a doc has been positively identified as having the pattern, you can just audit it. You can give the user some awareness. Don't send this message. It's got credit cards. It's against policy. Or you can block it, or you can stop it from getting saved. So a few options there. All right, so we've talked a lot actually about different things you can do to help your user not to give up credentials, different things you can do to help manage the flow of data through your orgs. Now let's get into a transparency feature. We've got a couple of transparency features, and that is, how do you know what's going on in your organization, especially once all your data is in the cloud and you're kind of dependent on our tools? How can you see what users are doing and make sure that they are not only adhering to policy, but if there's anything that looks kind of strange, you're aware of it? So again, a couple weeks ago at RSA, we announced activity logs in Office 365. And this is an API. It is not an experience. It's not an interface. But it's an API that you or a third party can call into with your credentials that can pull all of the activity data from everything that anyone's done to your tenant in Office 365. So all CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete, by all users, by all admins, by any Microsoft operators touching your data, any config changes, all login activity and history. We partner with Azure Active Directory to get all the information about login. So it's everything. And it is across Azure, Exchange, and SharePoint. And that is exposed in an API endpoint that can be used for a number of different things. The greatest need is security, but you can also get engagement metrics, you can get reports and dashboard, learn about whether people are complying, or even get a look into your operations, perhaps in terms of latency of things being done. And the way that we are surfacing it to you is by partnering with third parties. Because by involving other third parties, there'll be a variety of different ways they'll surface this that you can tailor to whatever your organization needs. So just to be clear, this is the list of current third party. This isn't endorsing anyone. I just wanted you to know what's out there, and I expect that there'll be more partners in the future. We certainly appreciate that they've started building experiences on top of this, so do look at it if this is an area that interests you. Here's a few examples. So they've all done things a little bit differently. Well, there's Sumo Logic flying by. Sumo Logic, some of these are concepts, some of them are close to release. Cloud Lock, Alert Logic, and Rapid7. I think there's one more that we got a concept for. This one kind of interesting, looking at logins and anomaly events. And finally, Polera. And Um, we will talk about activity logs more in the same session as, actually, Vijay, which session is it, if you want to learn more about activity logs? Do you remember?
Yeah, Rudy's session, actually.
Oh, Rudy's
There's a session
okay.
tomorrow on information protection.
Awesome. Yeah, tomorrow at 9 a.m., I believe Rudra Mitra, who's the Director of Information Protection, will be talking more about this as well. So I've got about 5 minutes left. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly show you the surface area for a reporting concept that we've put on top of SharePoint logs. And then we've got 2 more slides, and then we're done. All right, so this is the Office 365 portal. We'll go to the Compliance Center. Have to hide my password cut and paste here. All right, there we go. All right, Compliance Center, if you go to Reports here, we do have this sort of simple interface. It's not as elaborate as some of the examples you saw that are feeding off our Activity API, but you can view a simple set of activity reports. We can choose the user here. We'll choose Krista. Search. And you can see here Krista has added a user, she's reset a password, she's updated a user here. So fairly simple, but easy to consume reporting structure, reporting UI for some of the simpler reports for SharePoint and Azure right now. And just to cover the last concept in the talk today, device management. Office 365 has partnered with Intune to offer some basic device management, including conditional access, managing some of the functionality of device, and selective wipe. So just really quickly, if you enroll your users in this, they will have to enroll their devices, and then you control whose device has access to the data center based on whether they have the strong enough password policy, whether the device supports encryption, and whether it's jailbroken, for example. You can set device management policies, which will say that you don't want screen capture enabled, or you don't want Bluetooth communication enabled. And you can also do selective wipe of just the Office 365 data. So if you have someone leaving the company, today we have to wipe their whole phone, which isn't very fair to them, and they lose their kids' pictures. So the selective wipe is a really nice feature to honor your data while honoring your users. All right, so I certainly don't want to go over time, so just a quick recap that hundreds of billions of records, and we're invested accordingly. We want our cloud to be and feel very trustworthy. It's your data. You decide who gets to access it and who touches it. And there's a number of end user features that we can help you keep your data more secure in Office 365. All right, I would love if you could evaluate the session, would love your feedback. Thank you.